of the best things about hosting this podcast is that I get to meet and speak to people that I admire all the time. And the cool thing about this episode is that I am already friends with our guest, and I have had the privilege of sitting with him several different times at dinner or at the Sweetheart Auction and hearing many of his stories. But I want to introduce all of you to author Douglas Preston. He's the author of over 40 books, a number of which have been on the New York Times bestseller list. But I have to tell you that one of my favorite things about you, Doug, is that in all the times that I have gone to a dinner where you were either the star of the show or just a guest, I'm so fascinated by how you are not just one of the most interesting people at the table, but you're one of the most interested people. I think that's a huge gift that you always bring to the table. But I'm going to roll off just a tiny little bio here because I can't imagine that anybody doesn't know who you are, but you were an editor at the American Museum of Natural History. You taught nonfiction at Princeton. You've written all these books, and are you still the president of the Authors Guild? Is that still a thing?
No, Bunny. Actually, I've retired from that position and am now president emeritus. And glad to
Nice.
be, even though it was a very rewarding tenure, it was quite, it was a lot of work. So I'm glad to be emeritus.
Well, I want to hear, I want our listeners to hear, because this really is the I Love New Mexico podcast. And one of my favorite books that you ever wrote was Cities of Gold, although I like many of them. But I think it would be really fun for New Mexicans. I've talked about that book on the podcast before, in fact, as one of my favorite New Mexico books. But I think it would be fun for the guest of the podcast today to hear about that. What's the premise, and how in the world did you come up with that idea?
Well, it was a very crazy and in many ways a stupid idea. I moved to New Mexico from New York City. I'm a New Englander. I know nothing about horses, completely ignorant on that regard. But after moving to Santa Fe, I became fascinated with the first contact between Europeans and Native Americans in what would become New Mexico, especially Coronado's entrada. And so I conceived this idea of retracing Coronado's route across New Mexico and Arizona and New Mexico on horseback, even though I had no idea what I was doing. But I managed to persuade a friend, Walter Nelson, who's a Texan, who a little bit knew more than I did. And we embarked on this journey of 4 horses, two packed, 2 riding, down in southern Arizona on the Mexico-Arizona border. And we rode 1,000 miles, and this was in 1989. And it was an interesting trip. We did not follow any standard trails or roads. We were trying to follow Coronado's, believed to be Coronado's route on his search for the 7 cities of gold, which of course went through Santa Fe and went off as far as central Kansas. And we just packed our supplies on horseback and laid down about 1,000 fences and camped under the stars and ran out of water and ran out of food, but we did not kill or hurt a horse, thank God, and we learned everything the hard way. So when I wrote a book about it called Cities of Gold, which was published in the early 90s, and it sort of weaves in our trip, with the history of Coronado's expedition, but also I brought along a tape recorder and I recorded interviews with the various people we met. I mean, we crossed 9 Indian reservations. And so in those instances, and some instances, I would interview the governor of the Pueblo or others involved and get their idea, their oral histories, their history of what it was like when Coronado came through. And they had a very different view than
Of
others
course,
did.
yes.
But it was a complicated view. It's not cut and dried. But anyway, so it all got put together in a book called Cities of Gold.
Well, it's a wonderful book, but you've written a number of other books that were that are based in New Mexico, and I've tried to read all of them. I mean, there are at least there's at least one Nora Kelly book that's in New Mexico, isn't there? Is Old Bones the only one, or are there others?
Actually, let's see, there are now three, although one hasn't been published yet. Nora Kelly books that are set in New Mexico. She's an archaeologist who works with the fictitious Institute of Archaeology. And the other main character in those novels is Corey Swanson, who's a young FBI agent on her first assignment in the Albuquerque field office. So the two of them often team up. Well, they in each novel they do team up to solve unusual cases involving New Mexico history.
Well, I love those, and then I also am a fan. I want folks to know Lost Cities of the Monkey Gods and um, The Monster of Florence, right? Which is one of the scariest books I've read. That was a true story. That's um, I'm just curious. Do you like writing fiction or nonfiction better, or is there any specific?
Well,
I'm curious about that.
that's a good question because they're very different in one way,
Hmm.
and that is that nonfiction has to be absolutely accurate. There's no room for any kind of making up anything. And I write for the New Yorker magazine, and they have a ferocious fact-checking department. And if you get any small thing wrong, they'll find it before the article is published, and it's embarrassing. So nonfiction, you're really wedded to the facts. But the creativity in nonfiction is finding the story. It's what do you include and what do you leave out?
Hmm.
Because when you write nonfiction, 90% of what you know about the subject is left out. You Only 10% goes in.
Wow.
You have to know a lot more about the subject than what you're actually putting into print. Otherwise, you're not really don't have a grasp of the facts. Now, on the other hand, writing fiction, you're just making it all up. However,
Right.
fiction does also have a nonfiction component. I mean, our novels are set in New Mexico, many of them. We can't move Santa Fe to southern New Mexico. I mean, there's certain facts you have to maintain. And the more facts in fiction that you maintain, the more verisimilitude you build. But then the whole story, the characters, everything else is made up. But at base, you're telling a story. And that story that's the whole deal. You know, Whether you're reading fiction or nonfiction, if it's not a good story, it fails. So, as a writer, my obligation is always to tell a story that involves the reader, that draws them in, that they enjoy, whether it's true or made up.
Well, I'm curious, and I haven't read this yet. I'm sorry that I haven't read it yet. In fact, I'm going to buy it right now and start reading it. But The Lost Tomb is that the most recent nonfiction that you've published?
It is, and actually, that book is a collection of my earlier stories, nonfiction stories, mostly published in the New Yorker, but some also in the Smithsonian Magazine, Wired, and a few other places. But so you may have actually read some of those stories already.
I may have, but I was, of course, snooping around. I was doing as much. early research as I could before we talked, and I was really fascinated. I mean, the main reason I thought I've got to buy it is I want to know about and we talked about this at dinner, I believe a couple of years ago, the site in North Dakota where that you went, the archaeological site there. So I want you to tell our listeners a little bit about that, and then I want to hear about the Russians that got lost. I mean, that died in the woods. But talk a little bit about the archaeological site in North Dakota. I'm so fascinated by that.
That is an amazing site. Some years ago, I got an email from a graduate student in paleontology. He wasn't even a professor yet, and he said he'd found an incredible site, a site of many, many animals actually killed by the asteroid impact that caused the extinction of the dinosaurs. And no one had ever found a site like that. No one had ever found a site where the animals were killed. They'd found the boundary of ash and dust and everything left by the impact. But what he'd found was a site where something like a tsunami or a tidal wave uh, caused by the impact there was an inland sea that ran up from the Gulf of Mexico where the asteroid struck all the way up through the Dakotas. And so what he'd found was a site where this enormous wave had washed up violently, killing all these animals, tearing them apart, and also the shoreline where enormous forest fires were set. Because all this debris coming back down from the asteroid strike with red hot blobs of molten glass, shock waves, and everything caused forest fires that actually set fire to 75% of the forests of the entire globe. I mean, it was an amazing disaster, terrible disaster. And so he'd found this site. He found all these blobs of molten glass that had fallen into this churned up mud caused by this thing, and all these dead animals. They were fish from the sea mixed with freshwater fish, mixed with animals from land, mixed with bones. There were eggs. There were dinosaur feathers, an Archaeopteryx egg with the embryo still inside it. I mean, you wouldn't believe the things he found. Wood that was on fire from the forest fire, a sap in which micro tektites from the asteroid itself had fallen into the sap and been trapped. So they were biochemically and geochemically preserved. I mean, so it's one of the most important paleontological sites ever found in the history of paleontology. And it's about the size of 2 tennis courts. It's very small. It's very unassuming. It's sort of brown and gray. You'd never know that this site was the burial ground of that day, that one day, which the day the dinosaurs died.
And you have a book? I mean, what is extinction? Tell me what extinction is, because it makes me they feel related. Are they not? Is
Well,
extinction
that's a novel that I've written, which will be published in April. It's actually not connected. It's also
okay?
there is paleontology in it for sure,
Uh huh.
uh, but it's not really directly connected with this site. The
Okay.
novel Extinction is this is very interesting. I've not written about this yet, but there's a company founded by a very well-known genetic researcher at Harvard called George Church. And he and a group of scientists and investors started a company to resurrect the woolly mammoth, to bring it back to life. And they are doing that. This is not science fiction. Within 5 years, our lifetime, they are going to have resurrected live woolly mammoths. I mean, it's an absolutely incredible thing. And though, and they even have a place to put them. They've developed actually in two places in the world. One is in Siberia in Russia. Unfortunately, because of the war, that sort of fell by the wayside. But they've developed another homeland for these woolly mammoths in Alaska. And so in our lifetime, we will see woolly mammoths.
Wow.
And so the novel is about that, but it's about something else very quite frightening that is very closely linked to that. I can't say what it is because I don't want to spoil the novel.
Okay.
But the resurrecting of the woolly mammoth is the technology to do that will allow us, or is allowing us, because it's being done right now, is allowing scientists to resurrect other extinct life forms. And some of these are not so friendly.
So, and the book does it come out in April?
The pub date is April 23rd.
Okay, well, I guess I got to go somewhere and pre-buy it, right? April 23rd. Got it. Okay. So, I mean, there's so much that we could talk about, but I also have to hear the story. What's the deal with the Russians that tore their tent apart and ran away and were
Oh,
harmless?
that's a
Anyway,
fascinating story. Yes, I've been following that story for many years. It's known as the Dyatlov Pass incident, and it took place in 1959 in the old Soviet Union, in the Ural Mountains, which of course separate Russia from Siberia. It is one of the greatest mysteries that I've ever come across in my life. I'll set the scene for you. A group of 9 young people went on a very interesting cross country ski expedition crossing the Ural Mountains in wintertime. It was going to be a 16-day expedition, doing something that no one had ever done before, crossing these mountains that no one had ever crossed before. And this was a very challenging trip, but these 9 people were very experienced winter mountaineering campers, hikers, cross country skiers. They knew exactly what they were doing. Exactly. Well, when they didn't arrive at their final destination, a search was organized and they found the most bizarre scene. They found their tent. It was a single tent, which all 9 stayed in, above the tree line in the mountains. And everything in the tent was in order. The shoes were there, the meal was laid out like they were in the middle of a meal. Their clothing was there, their sleeping bags were laid out. Nothing was disturbed. But something had appeared in the door of the tent that so terrified them that they slashed their way out the side of the tent, ran out into the night, in the darkness, in the middle of a storm, in 20 below zero weather, mostly undressed in bare feet or socks, and ran out into the snow. They followed their footprints a mile down to the tree line, and there they found a really gruesome and bizarre set of scenes. They found 2 bodies by a fire that had been lit. The bodies were almost completely stripped. There were cuts and burns all over the bodies. On a tree above the fire, they found human skins 15 feet above the ground. They found 3 more bodies frozen on the slope leading up to the tent, going uphill as if they were going back to the tent. And also these bodies had little cuts and bruises all over them, and one had a very small skull fracture. And then some months later, they looked and looked, they couldn't find the other 4 bodies. Some months later, they found the other 4 bodies about 300 yards away, under 15 feet of snow. There was still a lot of snow at that time. And they had bizarre injuries. 3 of them had crushed chests. Several had crushed heads. Some were missing their eyes and their tongues. Um, and yet the skin on their bodies was not broken. And the medical examiner said it looked like they'd been hit by a truck, although there aren't any trucks. They were in the middle of the wilderness.
Right.
And finally, and nobody knows why, but they tested those bodies for radioactivity and found that unnaturally high levels of radioactivity. Now, for the final mystery. These five of these people had cameras. They found the film, they developed the film, and they found two photographs that aroused a lot of uh, interest. One showed, it was a blurry photograph, but it showed what some claim is what looks like a yeti or a furry monster or something coming out of the woods. I mean, it could also be a very blurry skier, frankly. The other photograph showed looked like weird lights and streaks in the sky. All right, so here's the question I pose to you, Bunny. What happened?
Has anyone, I mean, I saw that there had been an opinion created by somebody in authority, but that was debunked. I don't
Well, that's
know.
okay. So what happened was this was the old Soviet Union. So
Right?
there was an investigation, a really very careful investigation. Autopsies were performed, all kinds of interviews. They scoured the area. There were hundreds of photographs taken, and everything else. And then, of course, it was all classified, top secret, and locked away. Well, the families were not satisfied with this, and they agitated, and they wrote outraged letters to Khrushchev, who was the premier at the time, and raised hell. Well, nothing was done because in the old Soviet Union, this kind of thing was put under wraps. But in 1989, when the Soviet Union collapsed, all these files came back out, and there was a huge surge of interest in what had happened. And the prosecutor, the original prosecutor, went public and he said, "Look," he said, all our results were suppressed. They were suppressed. And what really happened was that this was an alien visitation, an alien attack, using some kind of energy directed weapons that burned these people that landed, and that's the source of the radioactivity and everything else. So this opinion, of course, aroused everybody, and then the Russian there was an investigation. There was a foundation created in Russia. What happened? More agitation from the families. And this agitation went on and on until a couple of years ago when the Russians finally reopened the investigation. And they hired a prosecutor, and he did all this very careful research. He was very good. He sent an expedition to the site. They took all these measurements. They took all these old photographs of the site and analyzed them very carefully. And he came up with a theory. And that's what I wrote about in the New Yorker magazine was what probably happened and why. I'm not going to tell you now because it's
Don't,
complicated.
nope.
But it's very you have to buy my book
I
to find
know.
out.
I'm going to.
The Lost Tube. No, not you. I'm talking to your audience. Everyone. No, I'm now indulging in a little shameless promotion. But what's very curious about this reopening of the investigation is that it went against Russian public opinion very strongly. Now, the Russians believe there are two competing theories now in Russia. One is that this was secret missile testing by the Russian military that went awry in some way. That's the first theory. The second theory, of course, is that this had something to do with America, the CIA agents, and spy, skullduggery and murder by the CIA. So this poor Russian prosecutor, whose theories did not match Russian public opinion, was fired. This is how things work in Russia. He was fired. Of course, his wife was also fired from her job because you fire everybody, right? The whole family is punished. And and there was an uproar in Russia about this prosecutor. Who was he? Why did he? And the case is still open. It has never been officially solved, and there it is.
Well, that reminds me of the monster of Florence, right? Because that was, I mean, that murderer was never found. Was he or she or whoever it was?
No, it was never solved. Now this is something. Maybe it's a defect in my. I'm a journalist and I write
Right?
stories about things, but I'm constantly being attracted to stories that don't have an answer, mysteries that haven't been solved. So the thing about the lost tomb, this my latest book, is that at least half, maybe two-thirds of the mysteries in that book are still mysteries. They've never been solved. And they are really, really puzzling. I mean, for example, the Oak Island treasure. For 200 years, people have been trying to figure out, to uncover the treasure buried on Oak Island, to figure out what's down there, who buried it, who booby trapped that water pit, very sophisticated piece of engineering, why, and on and so forth. So, I went to Oak Island and I spent, 2 weeks there with the treasure hunters and wrote this piece. But that was a while ago, and they still have not solved that mystery. There's a television show that's been going for years about it, but forget watching that show because you're never going to learn what's down there because they don't know. It's all just spinning up theories. So
So, is there a movie in the works for the monster of Florence? Am I crazy?
yes, yeah, the Monster of Florence was that's one of the stories in my book. It's about a serial killer who murdered young lovers in the hills around Florence, Italy in the 70s and 80s and was never caught. And it's a very strange case and really awful. It's worse than Jack the Ripper. I mean, it's just, the details of
It
this
is.
case
Yeah.
are absolutely horrific. And the investigations into it are almost unbelievable. The Italian police to date have investigated over 100,000 men
And you
as
were one of
possible
them, right?
suspects. I'm afraid I was one of them, as being an accessory after the fact, as knowing who the monster of Florence was. It's an absolutely crazy story, but Apple TV is making it into a series right now. So in a year or two, you'll be able to watch that on television and be as puzzled as everyone else.
So,
Now, in that case, though, I have to say, um, my writing partner and I wrote this book with Mario Spezzi, who was a Italian journalist. I used to live in Italy, in Florence, and we identified a person we think is the monster of Florence, and I really think he is. So, in a sense, that's not 100% a mystery. And we went and interviewed him, and we asked him, "Are you the monster of Florence?" And that interview is, without a doubt, the strangest and most frightening interview I've ever conducted as a journalist.
and so is the Apple TV series, is it specifically about your book or about the incidents?
It's specifically based on my book, and I'm a character in it. Mario Spezzi's a
Wow.
character in it. Um, they haven't cast me yet. Um,
That's what I was going to ask you. Who's playing Douglas Preston?
yeah, they haven't done that yet, but we'll see.
Okay. Okay. I think that young man that played Oppenheimer would be a good choice. What do you think?
I think he'd be great. Cillian Murphy.
Yes.
They have cast Mario Spezzi though. They have Antonio Banderas playing him. Now I know he's
Perfect.
Spanish, but apparently he speaks fluent Italian. So That's what I'm told. But they had, I know this is strange. They had for a while there, George Clooney was going to play me,
Cool.
but that didn't work out. And he's kind of aged out of the role. The character in The Monster of Florence is really in his 40s. So, Cillian Murphy would be great. I mean, God,
Yes,
now I wish, Bunny, I wish you were a Hollywood producer
I do
working on
too.
this project because, he'd be fantastic.
He would be fantastic. So I just want folks to know that this is I mean I never have a conversation with you where I don't go away wanting to learn a little more, read a little more, share more stories. I just think it's this amazing talent you have where you inspire us all to know our own. As cheesy as it sounds, you want to know as much. This is what I've learned from being in your presence is that you always want to know as much about the people you're spending time with as they want to know about you. It's such a gift to spend an evening with you. I want to applaud you on that. But it sounds to me like you've always had that just innate curiosity about the world and about people.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I grew up in a family of storytellers. And, round the dinner table, my father would tell stories, and my older brother, who's also a writer, would tell stories. My younger brother, who's a fantastic storyteller. I don't know. That's what we did. And when I was 5 and 6, I told stories about boogers, and was sent away from the table. But now I'm telling stories about serial killers, and they still want to send me away from the table.
And what about you and Lincoln Child? Do you have another book in the works together? Because you're sort of a formidable pair. What's happening there?
Well, we do. We're working on a novel. We have a novel called Angel of Vengeance,
Hmm.
and it will be published in August. And it's a Pendergast novel. We have an FBI agent that um, who's in a recurring character in our novels named
Everybody
Pendergast.
loves him.
Yeah.
Everybody loves Pendergast. Yes.
So it's that'll be published in August.
So it seems to me that there should be if I was a producer, I would immediately start a series from the very beginning of Pendergast. Uh, it seems like he should be I don't, I don't know why he's not on TV.
Well, as a matter of fact, Paramount Plus, the streaming series that does 1883 and on those
Right.
is now working on a television series based on Pendergast.
Yay! That's such exciting news. Nice.
Well, we'll see. It's just in the beginning stages. We just signed the contracts. We'll see how it works out. I think they're pretty good. Those shows, that 1883, 1923, the Yellowstone, those are darn
Yes.
good shows, and so I have high hopes for this.
That's so exciting. I'm so glad we chatted. Now I know. So, I I want to tell everybody just get online and buy if you've never read any of Doug's books, get online and buy several right now. Relic is the first one you guys did together, right? That you and
That's
Lincoln.
right. That was made into a movie, also by Paramount Pictures. Um, a very gruesome movie. I was shocked at it. I thought, who wrote this? This is terrible.
It's a
Anyway, yeah,
gruesome book.
I know it's odd. In writing the book, I was shocked because Paramount invited us for the director's showing of the film on the lot, and I was watching it thinking, this is really how horribly violent. I'm disturbed by all this violence. Then I was, oh wait, I wrote that.
And for people who don't know, it's the setting is the Museum of Natural History, right? Where you worked first.
That's right. Yeah, I did. I worked there for years, and in the in my novel, the director of the museum is killed and has his brain eaten. And it was a funny thing when I ran into the director. I'd left my job at that point, but I ran into the director in the museum after the book was published, and he said, you, he said, I'm so sorry you don't still work here, so I could fire you for writing that book, that terrible book.
Well, you're really good at the frightening stuff. I remember, I think the first time that I went to a dinner that you had donated up at the Hamilton's house, you said, "Oh, Lincoln and I are working on this book right now where a bunch of feet in shoes wash up on a Florida shore." Like, what in the world? And then I read the book, but I thought, where does this stuff come from? Because you're
Well,
such a
it's
gentle,
funny.
kind guy.
Well, thank you. No, well, actually, that's based on the truth. They're in the uh, Puget Sound in Washington. They're a number of feet in still encased in sneakers started washing up on shore, and they investigated, and there are reasons for that. I mean, but that gave us the idea for this novel. We thought that what a cool opening, just feet washing up on shore, and what
It's
could have
pretty
happened?
cool.
How did
It's
this happen?
very cool. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Well, um, for anybody who would like to spend an entire evening with you, I know this is evergreen content, but if you're listening to this right now between now and February 10th, 2024, you are welcome to come to the Sweetheart Auction and bid on dinner with Doug and his very charming wife Christine, and hear some of these stories yourself. You'll get to hear the story about Doug getting to go into one of the tombs of where were you? You were in Egypt. Which set of tombs?
Well, it was in the Valley of the Kings.
Oh,
It's
okay.
the tomb right next to King Tut's tomb, and it was discovered only in the 1990s. I mean, it is incredible. It's the amazing discovery.
Well, you have the most interesting life of anybody I know, Doug. So thank you for talking to me, but also thank you for donating. It's we you help us raise a lot of money for cancer patients. It's so
Well,
cool.
well, thank you, Bunny, for running the Sweetheart Auction. It's a really important fundraiser. It is such a wonderful organization helping people in New Mexico with cancer. I mean, I can't imagine a more important and thing to be doing. So I'm very so. Thank you, Bunny, for all your effort in that regard.
Listen, I just show up in a nice dress. We have the best staff and the best committee in the world. So I'm really proud. I'm really proud of what we do, and I'll see you there, right?
All right, I'm looking forward to it.
Okay. Well, thanks for being here today, Doug.
Oh, thank you, Bunny.